The summer the reservoir dropped low enough to show its old gravel bed. Nora Vasquez stood at the edge of a packed community hall in the high desert town of Cielo Seco and listened to the sound of 200 people deciding whether to trust her. The ceiling fans turned without urgency. The air smelled of dust and dried sweat and something older, the particular exhaustion of a valley that had been asking too much of itself for too long. She was 34 years old, and she held in the breast pocket of her work shirt a single folded document, and everyone in that room either wanted what she had or had already decided she did not deserve it. She did not speak yet. She had learned, in the 3 years since she arrived in this valley with almost nothing, and was laughed out of a county assessor's office for what she proposed to do, that being right is its own kind of reply, and that the reply lands harder if you let the silence do the work first. The man at the podium was named Garrett Finch. He wore a jacket the color of old money and a smile that he deployed like a tool, precise and without warmth underneath. He represented a consortium called Aquifer Solutions Partners, and he had been in Cielo Seco for 6 days, and in those 6 days he had used the words partnership and community and shared future so many times that several people who had distrusted him on day one were by this evening merely uncertain. He was explaining in reasonable and measured tones that the valley's groundwater situation was critical, that his consortium had the infrastructure to help, that the price they were offering was more than fair, and that the alternative to accepting his terms before the end of the month was a dry season with no plan at all. He did not look at Nora Vasquez when he said any of this. He had made the mistake 3 years ago of looking at her once and dismissing what he saw, and now the thing she had been quietly doing on 62 dry acres at the end of Toole Road was the only reason his entire pitch was in danger of collapsing. The real decision in that room had already been made. It had been made on a morning 2 years and 4 months earlier, when a woman who had been told her land was worthless knelt in the dirt beside a dry channel and put her ear close to the cracked earth the way you listen at a door, and heard something she was not supposed to hear. But the people in that hall did not know that story yet, or most of them did not. And so we need to go back to where it started, to the county assessor's office on a Tuesday in early October, 3 years before the heat and the silence and the man with the coalition-building smile. She had arrived in Cielo Seco with $41,000 and a certified copy of a deed. The $41,000 was what remained after a divorce that had taken 4 years and a lawyer who had taken a great deal of the rest, and the deed was something else entirely, something she had not known about until the month before, when her father died at 78 in a hospital bed in Tucson, and a probate attorney called her with the information that a second piece of property had been filed in her name 17 years earlier, quietly, without fanfare, by a man who had watched his daughter's first marriage forming and had understood something about where it was heading before she did. Her father had been a water engineer for 30 years. He knew the valley. He knew what was under it. He had paid $11,000 for 62 acres of hardpan at the east end of Cielo Seco in the year she turned 17, which made her 34 now and the deed itself exactly 17 years old, filed the deed in her name alone, and said nothing. When she showed that deed to her ex-husband's lawyer during the asset proceedings, the lawyer said it predated the marriage and was therefore separate property and therefore not subject to division, which was the first and only time that lawyer had ever done her a favor, and he had done it by accident. The assessor's office was staffed by a clerk named Dale, who had the habit of pressing his lips together when he was trying not to say something, and on the Tuesday she came in with the deed and the $41,000 and her plan to drill a water harvesting network on 62 acres of hardpan. Dale pressed his lips together so firmly they went white. He told her the property had been assessed 6 times since 1987 and had never produced anything. He told her the east end of the valley was a geological dead end, that every survey recommended against any investment. He told her this not unkindly, in the tone of a man delivering a diagnosis, and she thanked him and left. By the end of that first week, the information had circulated. A woman alone, people said. 62 acres of caliche flats. Paid good money for drilling equipment. In the diner on Route 9, the table nearest the window had opinions. A man named Burl Hafferty, who ran the largest conventional well operation in the valley and who had a voice trained for carrying across distances, announced that he had driven past the Toole Road property and could confirm it was exactly as worthless as everyone remembered, and that the woman who bought it was either city foolish or plain foolish, and probably both. This was considered a thorough assessment. Nora heard the version that filtered back to her and felt it land in her chest the way blunt things land, solid and brief. And then she went back to work. The work in those first months was a particular kind of hard that she had not anticipated. She had anticipated physical labor, and she had gotten it. She had anticipated loneliness, and she had gotten that too. What she had not anticipated was the specific quality of the doubt that set in when, after 6 weeks of drilling, her third probe location came up as dry as the first 2, and she sat on the gate of her truck at dusk and ran the arithmetic for the 14th time that month. She had $26,000 left. The drilling equipment cost $400 a day to lease. She had 9 borings mapped on her father's old survey notes, coded in a shorthand she was only partway through deciphering, and she had resolved 3 of them and found nothing. She was burning through the sum that stood between her and having to leave the valley at a rate of about $12,000 a month if the drilling continued, and she had, generously, 2 months left before the arithmetic made the choice for her. She ate a piece of bread over the sink that evening and looked at her father's survey notes and traced the lines he had drawn with his fingertip. She had loved him in the particular way of daughters who know their fathers are watching for things other people miss. He had never explained why he bought this land. He had never told her what he suspected was beneath it. All he had given her was the deed and the notes and the 17 years of silence, which now felt less like neglect and more like a message delivered at the only speed the situation permitted. She was 3 pages deeper into the shorthand when she heard from outside the sound of one of the goats. She had bought the goats because the 62 acres needed something living on them to qualify for the agricultural land use designation that reduced her property tax by 40%, and because goats were what she could afford, and because a herd of 14 boar crosses had been available at the estate sale of an old man named Pacheco who had died without heirs, and whose animals no one else wanted. She had paid $900 for all 14 and driven them to Toole Road in a borrowed trailer, and everyone who saw them agreed with Burl Hafferty's subsequent characterization, delivered at the Route 9 diner, that they were the sorriest-looking herd of brush goats in the county and had been correctly priced. The largest of them, a broad gray buck she had started calling Solomon because of the way he watched everything from a slight elevation without appearing to have any agenda, had stopped at the edge of her porch on his first morning, and regarded her with an expression she could only describe as bilateral. He was not impressed. He was not frightened. He was conducting an assessment, and he was willing to wait for her to become interesting. The sound she heard now was coming from the southeastern edge of the property, near the lip of the old dry channel her father had marked with a bracket on his survey. She took her flashlight and followed it, and found Solomon standing at the base of the channel bank, not distressed, not moving, simply standing there in the dark and pressing one hoof rhythmically into the soil in a particular spot. She crouched beside him. The soil under his hoof was different. It was, fractionally, cooler. It had a slight give that the surrounding caliche did not have. She pressed her own hand flat against it and held still. Being a water engineer's daughter means growing up with a particular vocabulary, and one of the words in that vocabulary is paleochannel, which is the term for an ancient buried watercourse that a surface survey might miss entirely because the landscape has closed over it the way scar tissue closes over a wound, leaving no visible trace above. Her father's shorthand, she understood now with a sudden clarity that felt like cold water, had not been mapping surface hydrology at all. He had been mapping what was underneath. She covered the spot with a tarp weighted by stones and went back inside and sat at the table and did not sleep. By 6 in the morning she had decoded enough of the notes to understand what her father believed was under the east end of this valley. He had believed, on the basis of 3 decades of professional intuition and 1 private survey he had paid for himself and never filed publicly, that beneath the caliche flats of the 62 acres on Toole Road there ran the remnant of a Pleistocene aquifer, sealed by the same geological event that made the surface look dead, and that it was not dry. It had simply never been reached by any bore sunk in the locations that the conventional surveys had identified, because every conventional survey had been working from the wrong map. She drilled the 4th location herself the following week, renting a smaller rotary unit she could manage solo, and at 61 feet, the bit found water. The man who came to check the early results was named Fortunato Reyes, and he was 83 years old, and he lived a quarter mile up the road in a house he had built with his brother in 1964. He arrived on foot on a weekday morning carrying 2 oranges, and he looked at what she had done and was quiet for a long time. He was a man who had farmed this valley for 60 years by methods that the county extension office had spent most of those 60 years discouraging. He had a face like old bark and a manner of speaking that suggested he was choosing each word from a large supply and spending only what the moment required. He said, and she wrote it in her notebook that evening because she knew even then that it was the kind of thing you should keep. He said, "The land does not hide its water from you. It hides it from the people who are asking the wrong question. You can only find what you are willing to listen for." He told her that the east end of the valley had a reputation for dryness that he had never fully believed, that the old Pacheco family had grazed animals on the Toole Road flats for 70 years, because the animals always drifted east when the rest of the range dried up, and that he had long suspected the animals were finding something the people were not clever enough to locate. He said this without any particular emphasis, as though it were simply a fact that had been waiting for someone to be interested in it. He became, without ceremony or formal announcement, the person she took her questions to. He taught her to read the goats. Not the 14 individuals she had bought from the Pacheco estate, though he knew them too and had opinions about each of them, but the general principle of what a goat's behavior is telling you when you are patient enough to observe without interfering. He said, "They are not smart the way a dog is smart. They are right the way the land is right. They already know the answer. You are just catching up." The boy appeared in the 4th month. His name was Tomas, and he was 9 years old, and he lived with his grandmother in a cinder-block house at the end of the road, because his mother was in Albuquerque, and his father was somewhere the grandmother did not specify. He arrived one morning and stood at the fence and watched and said nothing. The next morning he was there again. The morning after that she opened the gate, and he came in and went directly to Solomon and put his small hands on the gray buck's face, and the animal stood perfectly still and allowed it, which was not something Solomon allowed everyone. She handed the boy a curry comb and did not explain anything, and he began to work without being told what to do. He named the others, not the names she had given them, which were provisional and mostly functional, but real names, names with reasons. The smallest doe he called Milagro, which means miracle, because she had been the last one out of the trailer and had walked onto the property looking around as though she had been expecting to arrive somewhere, exactly like this. The old spotted female he called Sombra, because she stayed in the shadow of whatever was largest near her. He named them all within the first week and remembered every name without effort, and corrected Nora gently when she used the wrong one. And she accepted the correction because he was right, and because he was 9, and because there was no pride in the work that needed protecting from a 9-year-old boy. He never mocked her. In a valley that had spent 4 months finding her ignorance entertaining, Tomas treated her methods as sensible, and her progress as obvious, and her presence on Tull Road as a settled and permanent fact. And the ordinary decency of this was, on certain evenings, when she was tired enough to feel it fully, almost more than she could carry without showing. She drilled 7 more locations over the following 5 months. 6 of them found the Paleo Channel at depths between 58 and 74 feet. The combined yield, when she had a hydrogeologist from the university come out to measure it, was assessed at exactly 400 gallons per minute under sustainable draw, which the hydrogeologist confirmed was a significant discovery. He asked her if she had filed a water claim. She said she had. She had filed it on the same day she decoded her father's notes, 6 weeks before she drilled the 4th bore, because her father had also been a man who understood that being first to file is its own kind of argument. She did not announce any of this. This is the part that the people in Cielo Seco did not understand until much later. That for 11 months from the day she confirmed the aquifer to the day the drought arrived, with the force of a door flung open on a kiln, she had been right and they had been wrong, and she had not told them. She banked it the way you bank a fire you need to last through a cold night, laying the knowledge flat and covering it with ordinary behavior, continuing to be the woman alone on Tull Road with the sorry herd of brush goats and the foolish ideas about dry land, while underground, in the quiet dark where no survey had ever looked, her inheritance was holding 4 years of water. Garrett Finch arrived in the valley 8 months after her discovery, which was 3 months before the drought. He came representing Aquifer Solutions Partners and proposing to buy out the groundwater rights of the valley's 43 existing well operations and consolidate them under a managed extraction program. His pitch was coherent and professionally delivered, and his initial offer to the large operators was fair, and most of them, including Burl Hafferty, signed preliminary letters of intent within his first 2 weeks. His offer to Nora Vasquez was delivered in person at her gate on a Tuesday morning, and it was for $48,000 for the full 62 acres, including all filed water claims. He mentioned that the property's assessed value was $31,000 and that he was offering a substantial premium out of respect for what she had put into it. He said this with the warmth of a man doing a favor. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "No, thank you." He nodded and said that the offer would remain open and that he hoped she would reconsider, and she said she was sure she would not. And he left. And as he was walking back to his truck, she watched him make a note in a phone. And she thought about that note later, in the context of other things, and kept the thought filed away. He came back twice more over the next 6 weeks with higher numbers, and both times she declined, and both times he left with a note taken and a smile that had thinned by a degree that only careful watching would detect. After his 3rd visit, she drove to Fortunato Reyes's house and sat at his kitchen table and told him what she thought Finch was doing. The old man listened and peeled an orange and said, "A man who keeps offering more is a man who knows what you have. He is not buying because he wants the land. He is buying because he is afraid of what you will do with it." She went home and looked at the original note from his first visit, which she had saved, and at the number he had offered. And she thought about the 400 gallons per minute and did the arithmetic again. And the arithmetic came out the same way it always did, which was in her favor by a distance that made her quiet for a long time. The drought arrived in the 3rd week of June. The meteorological description is that a persistent high-pressure ridge stalled over the southwest and declined to move for 11 weeks, but the lived experience was of the valley opening its throat and finding nothing there. The Rio Seco Channel, which ran 2 inches in a good year, went to dust in 4 days. 12 of the 43 conventional well operations in the valley hit declining yield warnings in the first 3 weeks. Burl Hafferty's primary well, the deepest in the valley at 220 feet, dropped to 40% capacity by the 5th week, which was the week he drove to Toole Road and parked his truck and sat in it for a while before getting out. She saw him from the kitchen window. She had been expecting him for 2 days, not because she knew it would be Burl Hafferty specifically, but because she had been running the drought arithmetic since the 2nd week, and she knew the order in which things would fail, and she had a list. He was the 3rd name on the list. He came to the gate and she opened it, and they stood in the partial shade of the old mesquite at the property's edge. He was a large man, and the drought had made him look smaller in the way that reversals of fortune do, not in his body, but in the space he occupied, as though the certainty that had taken up most of the room was gone and the air had come back in. He said that his herd was in trouble, and that he had heard she had water, and that he would like to discuss terms. He said the word terms the way a man says it when he has decided to stop being the kind of man who can dictate them. She asked him how much he needed, and he told her, and she said she would provide it at cost of conveyance, which was the price of running the pump and the pipe for the hours required, and nothing more. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him trying to find the catch and not finding it, and she said, "I know what you said at the diner. You said it more than once. I am not holding it against you, Burl. Your cattle were not at the diner." She told him to bring them by Thursday. That was the week the valley began to understand what was on Toole Road. The 2nd person on her list came on Friday, and the 3rd came the following Monday, and by the end of the 2nd week, she had committed water to 7 operations covering 1,180 acres of the surrounding valley, all at cost of conveyance, all written on paper, all signed. Fortunato Reyes helped her write the agreements in his kitchen because he had a precise and formal handwriting from a school he had attended as a child in Sonora, and because the act of putting things on paper was, he said, the only language the land does not already speak for itself. She had Tomas count the pages when they were done. He counted them twice and reported that there were 22 pages, 3 for each of the 7 operations plus 1 cover sheet, and that Solomon had eaten the corner of one of them, which she noted and had Fortunato initial. Garrett Finch called her on the 9th day of her water commitments. His voice was still warm, and the warmth was doing more work than it could hold. He said he understood she was providing water to a number of operations in the valley, and that he wanted to discuss the logistics of incorporating her resource into the consortium's emergency response framework, which would allow a more efficient distribution, and that, of course, his organization would take on the administrative burden so she would not have to manage individual agreements. She said, "That is generous." She said, "I already have agreements." He said that individual agreements were informal instruments and that in a declared emergency situation, the county might have questions about whether private water provision required additional permits and oversight, and his consortium could smooth that process. She said, "I have spoken to the County Water Board. They have reviewed my filed claim and the agreements. Everything is in order." She said this in the same quiet tone she used when Solomon was being unreasonable at a gate, which was the tone that produced compliance not through force, but through the communication of absolute immovability. He attended the community hall meeting 12 days later. The meeting had been called by 3 of the valley's family operations to discuss the drought situation, and what it had become by the time the evening arrived was something different because word had spread and the hall was full, and Garrett Finch had called 3 of the preliminary signatories to remind them of their letters of intent and to suggest that the meeting was an opportunity to formalize the consortium arrangement, while the emergency provided motivation for community action. He stood at the podium and was doing very well until he got to the part about the Toole Road resource. He said that he had been working on a comprehensive assessment of available water in the valley for several months, and that the Toole Road aquifer represented, in his consortium's estimate, a yield of approximately 380 gallons per minute of sustainable draw, and he explained how the consortium could manage that resource for the community's benefit. He said 380 gallons per minute. She had told no one outside the agreements what the hydrogeologist's assessment was. It was in a report she kept in a locked box. The number Finch had stated was wrong by 20 gallons per minute. He had not obtained the report by honest means. He had obtained it by some means that required him to have access to information she had not shared. And the only way to explain the 20-gallon error was that whatever he had obtained was not the final report, but a preliminary field note that she had written by hand and kept in the truck's glove compartment on the day of the assessment. And the only days that truck had been anywhere she was not watching it were the 3 times he had come to her gate. The hall was waiting for him to continue. She stood up. She was not at the podium, but she did not need the podium because the room had the acoustic quality of an old building that carries a quiet voice to its far walls. And her voice, when she used it for this purpose, was the kind that does not require elevation to reach. She said, "I would like to ask Mr. Finch how he arrived at 380 gallons per minute." He turned to look at her for the first time that evening. The smile was steady. He said, "Our own assessment." She said, "Your consortium has not set foot on my property with my knowledge or permission." She said, "The number 380 appears in a document I wrote by hand and kept in my own truck." She said, "The accurate number, which appears in the filed hydrogeological report, is 400 gallons per minute." She held up the report. She said, "I am happy to share copies with anyone in this room." She said it without drama, the way you state a measurement. There were 20 seconds of the kind of silence that only occurs when something that has been working in shadow is suddenly in full light. And in those 20 seconds, Garrett Finch stood at the podium, and his smile completed its transition from instrument to artifact. And then a man in the third row said something to the man next to him that she did not catch, and the room began to change temperature. He said several more things. He said that any discrepancy in numbers was a matter of preliminary versus final data, and that his consortium had made no claim of having accessed her property, and that the community should consider the responsible path forward, and that individual resource management in a declared drought emergency was exactly the kind of fragmentation that made regional crises worse, and that his offer for the full water rights remained on the table at a number that was fair by any metric. Burl Hafferty, from the fourth row, stood up and said he had a signed agreement with the Tool Road operation and that it was meeting his herd's needs and that he had not been asked to pay anything unreasonable. A woman named Clara Duran, who ran a small organic operation on the valley's west side, said that she had seen the agreements and they were honest instruments. Fortunato Reyes, who was sitting near the back door because he had arrived late and would not make anyone move to give him a better seat, did not say anything, but he nodded once, with the deliberate precision of a man ratifying a conclusion he had reached long before the meeting. She stood again. She said, "I am not selling the water rights, not to the consortium and not to anyone else." She said, "The water agreements I have made are for cost of conveyance for the duration of the emergency, renewable by mutual agreement, and they are open to any operation in the valley that needs them." She said, "If the valley wants to discuss a community water cooperative structure for long-term management, I am willing to contribute the Tool Road resource as the founding endowment at a nominal lease, provided the cooperative structure keeps governance local and keeps extraction within the hydrogeologist's sustainable limit." She looked at Finch. She said, "If Mr. Finch's consortium would like to be one of the cooperative's service providers at a contracted rate for infrastructure work, I have no objection to that either, so long as the rate is reviewed annually by the cooperative's board, and the board is made up of valley residents." This was not what he had come to the hall for, and it was not what she had come to the hall for either, because she had come simply because it was her valley now, and the meeting was happening in it, and she belonged to it. But it was what the evening became. Finch sat down. Not the sitting down of a man who has decided to wait and try again, but the sitting down of a man who has run out of forms the argument can take. The hall came to its own decision in the way that halls do, not with a vote, but with a shift, a collective reorientation visible in the angle of bodies and the direction of voices. And within the next half hour, the conversation was about the cooperative and not about the consortium. And 3 people had volunteered for the interim board, and Clara Duran had suggested a name, and Burl Hafferty had said something that approximated an apology by never using the word sorry, but getting there by other roads. Finch left before the meeting ended. The hall did not stop to watch him go. After, in the parking lot, Tomas found her by the truck. He had been in the hall for the whole of it, sitting on the floor against the wall near the windows because he was 9 and could see over no one. He said, "Did you know he was going to say the wrong number?" She said, "I thought he might." He said, "How did you know he had the wrong paper?" She said, "Because I counted pages, and one was missing." This was not precisely true, and was not precisely untrue, and Tomas considered it, and nodded, and said that Solomon had eaten a corner of 1 page, not a whole page, and she said she knew, and he said okay, and he went back to find his grandmother. Fortunato was the last one in the parking lot. He walked out slowly with the unhurried movement of a man who has always understood that the work continues after the event, and he stopped beside her in the warm dark, and they looked at the valley together. The heat had not broken yet. It would not break for another 18 days, but even in the dark you could feel the particular quality of a place that has passed through its worst moment and is beginning, not to recover, because recovery is a longer story, but to remember that it has the necessary material. He said, "Your father knew the question to ask." She said, "He knew it for a long time before I did." The old man said, "That is often how it goes. The knowing travels down and the asking comes later, and between the 2 of them the answer is found." He said, "He bought land that looked like nothing and filed it where no one would look, and he waited to see if you would be the one who could hear what it was saying." She did not say anything. He said, "You were." Then he said good night and walked up the road toward his house, and she stood for a while longer beside the truck in the dark and thought about her father, who had known something 17 years ago and had said it in the only language he was sure she would eventually be able to read, which was the language of a deed filed in her name alone. The rains came on the 31st day after the hall meeting, ordinary desert monsoon rains, neither dramatic nor excessive, the kind that arrive and do their work without asking for recognition. The valley floor absorbed them with the focus of living things that have been waiting without complaint. The Rio Seco ran 2 inches by the following morning. Burl Hafferty's primary well began its recovery within the week. The Community Water Cooperative had its first formal board meeting on a Thursday in mid-September in the same hall, with ceiling fans turning at the same unhurried rate, though the air smelled now of damp earth, which is one of the better things air can smell of. She sat on the board as one of 5 members and was not the chair, because she had declined the chair in favor of Clara Duran, who had the particular gift of running a meeting with both patience and authority, and because the cooperative was not hers to own. The Paleo Channel aquifer under Toole Road was filed in her name, and it was legally hers, and she had understood, from the day she decoded her father's notes, that owning something and belonging to something are related but distinct, and that the second one is what you are actually after. Tomas continued to come to the property after school. He was working by October on a junior 4-H project centered on boar cross management, which required him to document the herd's behaviors and growth rates and feed conversion, and which gave him official reason to be on the property on weekday afternoons. as though the previous 9 months of simply showing up and being useful had required supplementary justification. Solomon tolerated the documentation clipboard with the same expression he brought to most of Tomas's activities, which was one of suspended judgment that occasionally resolved into approval. Milagro had delivered twins in August. Tomas had named them before Nora asked him to, which was the only sensible order of operations, and their names were Primer and Segundo, and they were doing well. Fortunato Reyes came to the property on a Friday in late October with 2 oranges, as he always did, and they sat on the porch in the cooling afternoon, and she asked him the question she had been holding for a year, which was how he had known, on that first morning 3 years ago, that she was not a fool. He was quiet for a while, peeling the orange with the systematic patience he brought to everything. He said, "I did not know. I only knew that you were listening. Most people who come to new land come with the answer already made. They are looking for the land to confirm what they decided before they arrived." He said, "You came with your father's question and no answer at all, and that is a different thing entirely." He said, "The land does not hide its water from the people who are willing to ask." She had heard him say this before, or the version of it he had said on that first morning, and she had written it down and kept it and returned to it at the turns in the road, in the months when she was running the arithmetic and finding it barely sufficient, in the weeks when she was banking the secret in the dark and enduring the pity and the condescension and the regular reports of what was said about her at the Route 9 diner, in the days when she was sitting at her father's notes and trying to learn a language he had never directly taught her. She had returned to it the way you return to a fixed point when you are navigating somewhere you have not been, not because the fixed point tells you where you are going, but because it tells you where you are, and where you are is always the beginning of the next calculation. She had been a woman alone on dry land with a worthless herd and a fool's plan, and the land had given her everything in exchange for nothing more than the willingness to ask it the right question. She poured the coffee. The valley lay below them in the late afternoon light, its arroyos running clean again, its pastures beginning their slow recovery, its 43 operations managing their water with a little more care than they had before the summer, as communities manage things when the cost of carelessness has been recently and concretely demonstrated. The goats were in the east pasture in the long slant of the sun. Solomon was on his slight elevation, watching. Tomas was down the slope with the clipboard and his precise Junior 4-H handwriting, counting and noting, which is what it means to learn to listen to a place. And he was 9 years old, and he was already learning to ask the right question before the land had to spend 17 years waiting for him to be ready. Fortunato drank his coffee and did not say anything else for a while, and this too was a form of aphorism, the kind that does not require words because the thing it is telling you is right there in front of you if you are paying the kind of attention that the valley had been teaching all along to anyone patient enough to stay.